Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about movies, music, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Danny Brown, titled Old. First, let's talk about artistic dichotomy. Now, this is a bit of an odd topic, but it's one that does require a bit of an explanation, particularly considering its rise within music, particularly in hip-hop and rap. Now, the principle is fairly simple. You're holding two exclusive thoughts in your music simultaneously. Or, to put it in simpler terms, the whole concept of the thug lover or the gangster with a sensitive side. You know, it really doesn't make a lot of sense when you start thinking about it, but I'm not surprised at all why so many rappers actually try it out. Because, well, you're nailing two different markets, and you get all the more radio play because of it. Now, the issue becomes whether or not that separation of two exclusive ideas can actually be believable holding them simultaneously, which is the problem I tend to find with most of these acts. For instance, Ja Rule very much wanted to emulate Tupac, but he also appeared on duets with female singers throughout the early 2000s and tried to come across as a real sensitive dude. And it completely backfired on him because the image didn't hold up under deeper scrutiny. For a more recent example, let's take a look at Drake. It's clear he's more comfortable in the sensitive R&B vein, but yet he still plays the thug, and it's rarely believable. It requires an extremely talented artist who can hold multiple personas very successfully. It requires a very versatile artist at that, and it takes an even better one to make them come across as remotely cohesive on the same album. So, enter Danny Brown, a rapper from the underground in Detroit who made major waves in 2011 with XXX, an album where Danny Brown pushed that dichotomy between thug and conscientious rapper to the absolute limit, splitting his album into two segments: the sleazy, often grossly explicit thug, and then the more streetwise, down-to-earth rapper who was able to provide context for such behavior. It helped matters that Danny Brown seems a lot smarter than the average girls, riches, cars-obsessed rapper, and his meta-commentary strewn throughout both sides of the album did wonders for bringing it all together in the end. Plus, from an instrumentation, production, technical rapping standpoint, the majority of the album is damn near flawless. Going into XXX, I was expecting just another mixtape, and I left with my mind blown because this guy, he's legit. Both as an extremely convincing gangsta presence and as a rapper who can intelligently speak to the grimier, more depressing lifestyles that cultivated and influenced that gangster image, particularly in Detroit. So with that in mind, I was intrigued by the fact that Danny Brown's new album, Old, would be exploring that dichotomy yet again in a different way. But I was also a little bit worried. This album was clearly being marketed as bigger and more aimed at the mainstream hip-hop community, with collaborations with A$AP Rocky on this album, and with more writers on board with every track, including Kanye West. I was worried that some of the more incisive commentary or risky subject matter would get sanded down. Was I right? Well, not quite. While I don't think that Danny Brown's Old is quite as strong as XXX, it's also aiming to do something very different than its predecessor. Brown himself came out many times saying that this album would be different than the first, and you know what? He's not wrong. But I don't think the differing change in direction works quite as well as his last album, despite the very solid execution. Keep in mind this is still an album that I do like and that I will recommend, but there are a number of steps that it takes that just undercuts what it could have been just a much more effective record, and that's a little disappointing to me. So let's start with Danny Brown's vocal delivery. For the most part, I've got no issues. I've always thought that his slower, more measured raps are a lot more impacting, but I'm not going to deny that there's a certain attention-grabbing intensity to his more deranged side, reminiscent of Old Dirty Bastard, that does draw a lot of attention. And while there are, unfortunately, more lyrics here that get on my nerves on this album than on the last, for the most part, it's far above functional. And as I've said before, Danny Brown is extremely convincing, portraying both the conscientious rapper he is at heart and the more insane trap luxury rapper. Hell, if I was looking for a rapper who made trap instrumentation work in a luxury club rap context, it'd be here, mostly because Danny Brown spits with just enough of a wry, sardonic tone to actually justify that ego that he brings to his material. On top of that, the production instrumentation is mostly great across the board, doing a superb job balancing real grit and texture in the mix with these darker, watery synths and clattery production that often adds a great sense of menace that often fits the lyrics brilliantly. But it's here that we run into the first issue I have with this album, and that's on the second half. The synths get a lot cleaner, a lot higher up in the mix, and arguably a lot less tolerable. Now, I'll accept some of this might just be my issue. I've never liked trap instrumentation paired with transparent luxury rap about cash, drugs, and hoes, but on tracks like Side B, Dope Song, and Headstand, they just sound more decadent, and paired with Danny Brown's lyrics, all the more shallow and like transparent. And with Danny Brown, that might have been part of the point, showing how transparent and unsatisfying the rich made it lifestyle is once you've got there, but it doesn't make the songs any more likable. But look, I'm getting ahead of myself here, so let's get to the real meat of this album, and what I find both interesting and frustrating about Danny Brown: his lyrics and themes. Here we need to establish the underlying themes of Triple X, which are important because Old is something of a natural continuation of that particular album. Like the external dichotomy between thug and conscientious rapper, Triple X also had something of an internal dichotomy when it came to Danny Brown's motives. He made it clear throughout his rhymes that he was better and smarter than so many of those rappers who had made it, and yet he still wanted to get into that group. He wanted that success to get him out of the trap, which he described in vivid detail. That's one of the reasons why Triple X worked as well as it did. It cast into sharp relief what he was willing to do to get to that top, and provided the necessary context to show why he was going to get there. But on Old, we get a bit of an inversion of this theme. The first half of this album provides the deeper context and grit and history, showing the process of how Danny Brown is dealing with his newfound fame and cult following. And this part of the album, I've got to admit, is incredibly compelling. Danny Brown has a gift for detail and deeper poignancy that makes songs like 25 Bucks featuring Purity Ring and Torture and Lonely and Cleanup just so effective and moving. He talks about rising out of nothing and how even if he becomes successful, he deals with the shifts in expectation amongst his peers, and how even if he tries to help his family, he can't fix every problem, and it's incredibly sad and it's incredibly moving. And then the album switches gears, and we had a series of songs about drugs, partying, more drugs, girls, sex, and yet again more drugs. He might open with Dope Song, saying it's gonna be the last song he ever raps about pot, but it proves to be a complete lie as weed comes up time and time again until the end of the album. Now, you could say that it's commentary about how rappers who used to talk about drugs all the time try to sober up in their image, but I'm not sure I buy that, considering how there are only sparse moments in the second half of this record where we see glimpses of that deeper intellect and commentary on the industry at whole. Indeed, it's not until the last two songs on this album where we see any of that poignancy from Triple X return, as Danny Brown tries to justify his overuse of pot and Molly and coke as just a way to deal with his inner turmoil. Hell, his references through painkillers all throughout the final track Float On is proof of that entirely. In other words, the interpretation that can be easily drawn here is that Danny Brown feels, in order to have made it on the second half of this record, that he sold out, and then he can only deal with that existential emptiness and feeling of inner betrayal by clouding his mind altogether. Okay, yeah, this is potent. And the final line, "Pray I get old just to hear I've been the future, just to hear my influence on this genre of music," at the end of Float On, that's an incredibly powerful lyric. It has a lot of weight and shows it pretty much encapsulates the entire feelings of that Danny Brown is bringing towards on this album, his entire feeling of existential confusion. But here's my point, and where I feel that Danny Brown might be misunderstanding his critical fan base, and indeed the entire impetus for taking his album in this direction. People who like Triple X might love the club bangers, sure, but they also love the cutting commentary and the gleeful subversion that was triggered by the excess of that album, and the deeper context that was granted through the second half to justify that subversion. When I look at Old, I see plenty of the greater context on the first half of the album, but the more subversive element, the one that was providing the commentary on the industry and other artists throughout the Deranged Club songs, well, it's not there to the same extent on the second half of the album. If anything, it feels like he's aping some of the trends that were brought upon by some of these club luxury rappers. Again, that might have been part of his point, but it also makes the second half of this album not really stand out to me outside of Kush Coma and Float On. Look, I'm not saying that any of these tracks in the second half are bad. Most of them are perfectly serviceable club bangers, but they just felt shallower than Danny Brown is capable, and you know what, that's a little disappointing. We have tons of songs already in the marketplace about Molly and pot and coke, and with the production and instrumentation not quite being at the level of the first half of the album, I just can't help but feel that the second half is very distinctly weaker. And yeah, sure, that might have been part of Danny Brown's point, emphasizing how when you go towards that shallower luxury rap feel, when you do sell out, there's going to be a drop-off in quality, but without that necessary incisive commentary, it didn't make the songs any more enjoyable to me, which, as I said, kind of disappointing. Yet despite all this, I do recommend Danny Brown's Old. It's certainly an interesting album, and there are a ton of elements I liked more than I expected. The entire first half of this record, the first 10 tracks or so, nearly all of them are superb and very much worth your time, but the second half isn't as strong in my opinion and doesn't quite work as well in this case, particularly if one makes the argument that's informed by the context provided by the first half. Once again, I have an idea where Danny Brown might have been going here, but I'm not quite sure it works as well as XXX, which is a bit of a shame. This also makes the album significantly more difficult to rate, so keep in mind that this might evolve at some point in my mind throughout this year. But right now, I'm thinking this album sits at a 7 out of 10. If you're interested in Danny Brown as an underground rapper though, I highly recommend you check out Old all the same, at least the first half of this record and the final 2 tracks. In the world where most rappers seem to be running out of things to say and new ways in which to say it, Danny Brown does prove that he has the intellect to stand amongst the greats, and you know what? He deserves support for that, if nothing else. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful for it. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to take a listen to, I'd be more than happy to take a look. Until then, see you next time.